narrowing of the nave into the chancel, and in the shadow of that contraction. The face was beautiful in feature. The next to it was a grinning monkey. But it was not the features that were the most striking part. There was a half-open mouth, not in any way distorted out of its exquisite beauty by the intense expression of suffering it conveyed. Any distortion of the face by mental agony implies that a struggle with circumstance is going on. But in this face, if such a struggle had been, it was over now. Circumstance had conquered, and there was no hope from mortal endeavour, or help from mortal creature to be had. But the eyes looked onward and upward to the hills from whence cometh our help. And though the parted lips seemed ready to quiver with agony, yet the expression of the whole face, owing to these strange, stony, and yet spiritual eyes, was high and consoling. If mortal gaze had never sought its meaning before, in the deep shadow where it had been placed long centuries ago, yet Ruth's did now. Who could have imagined such a look? Who could have witnessed, perhaps felt, such infinite sorrow, and yet dared to lift it up by faith into a peace so pure? Or was it a mere conception? If so, what a soul the unknown carver must have had, for creator and handicraftsman must have been one. No two minds could have been in such perfect harmony. Whatever it was, however it came there, imaginer, carver, sufferer, all were long passed away. Human art was ended, human life done, human suffering over. But this remained. It stilled Ruth's beating heart to look on it. She grew still enough to hear words which have come to many in their time of need, and awed them in the presence of the extremest suffering that the hushed world had ever heard of. The second lesson for the morning of the 25th of September is the 26th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel. And when they prayed again, Ruth's tongue was unloosed, and she also could pray, in his name who underwent the agony in the garden. As they came out of church, there was a little pause and gathering at the door. It had begun to rain. Those who had umbrellas were putting them up. Those who had not were regretting and wondering how long it would last. Standing for a moment, impeded by the people who were thus collected under the porch, Ruth heard a voice close to her say, very low but very distinctly, "I have much to say to you, much to explain. I entreat you to give me the opportunity." Ruth did not reply. She would not acknowledge that she heard, but she trembled nevertheless, for the well-remembered voice was low and soft, and had yet its power to thrill. She earnestly desired to know why and how he had left her. It appeared to her as if that knowledge could alone give her a relief from the restless wondering that had distracted her mind, and that one explanation could do no harm. No, the higher spirit made answer, it must not be. Ruth and the girls had each an umbrella. She turned to Mary and said, "Mary, give your umbrella to Mr Donne, and come under mine." Her way of speaking was short and decided. She was compressing her meaning into as few words as possible. The little girl obeyed in silence. As they went first through the churchyard stile, Mr Donne spoke again. "You are unforgiving," said he. "I only ask you to hear me. I have a right to be heard, Ruth. I won't believe you are so much changed as not to listen to me when I entreat." He spoke in a tone of soft complaint, but he himself had done much to destroy the illusion which had hung about his memory for years whenever Ruth had allowed herself to think of it. Besides which, during the time of her residence in the Benson family, her feeling of what people ought to be had been unconsciously raised and refined, and Mr Donne, even while she had to struggle against the force of past recollections, repelled her so much by what he was at present, that every speech of his, every minute they were together, served to make her path more and more easy to follow. His voice retained something of its former influence. When he spoke, without her seeing him, she could not help remembering former days. She did not answer this last speech any more than the first. She saw clearly that, putting aside all thought as to the character of their former relationship, it had been dissolved by his will, his act and deed, and that, therefore, the power to refuse any further intercourse whatsoever remained with her. It sometimes seems a little strange how, after having earnestly prayed to be delivered from temptation, and having given ourselves with shut eyes into God's hand, from that time every thought, every outward influence, every acknowledged law of life, seems to lead us on from strength to strength. It seems strange sometimes, because we notice the coincidence, but it is the natural, unavoidable consequence of all, truth and goodness being one and the same, and therefore carried out in every circumstance, external and internal, of God's creation. When Mr Donne saw that Ruth would not answer him, he became only the more determined that she should hear what he had to say. What that was, he did not exactly know. The whole affair was most mysterious and piquant. The umbrella protected Ruth from more than the rain on that walk homewards, for under its shelter she could not be spoken to unheard. She had not rightly understood at what time she and the girls were to dine. From the gathering at meal times she must not shrink; she must show no sign of weakness. But oh, the relief, after that walk, to sit in her own room, locked up, so that neither Mary nor Elizabeth could come by surprise, and to let her weary frame weary with being so long braced up to rigidity and stiff quiet fall into a chair anyhow, all helpless, nerveless, motionless, as if the very bones had melted out of her. The peaceful rest which her mind took was in thinking of Leonard. She dared not look before or behind, but she could see him well at present. She brooded over the thought of him, till she dreaded his father more and more. By the light of her child's purity and innocence, she saw evil clearly, and yet more clearly. She thought that, if Leonard ever came to know the nature of his birth, she had nothing for it but to die out of his sight. He could never know, human heart could never know, her ignorant innocence, and all the small circumstances which had impelled her onwards. But God knew, and if Leonard heard of his mother's error, why, nothing remained but death, for she felt then as if she had it in her power to die innocently out of such future agony. But that escape is not so easy. Suddenly a fresh thought came, and she prayed that, through whatever suffering she might be purified, whatever trials, woes, measureless pangs God might see fit to chastise her with, she would not shrink, if only at last she might come into his presence in heaven. Alas! the shrinking from suffering we cannot help. That part of her prayer was vain; and as for the rest, was not the sure justice of his law finding out even now? His laws once broken, his justice and the very nature of those laws bring the immutable retribution; but if we turn penitently to him, he enables us to bear our punishment with a meek and docile heart, for his mercy endureth for ever. Mr Bradshaw had felt himself rather wanting in proper attention to his guest, inasmuch as he had been unable, all in a minute, to comprehend Mr Donne's rapid change of purpose, and before it had entered into his mind that, notwithstanding the distance of the church Mr Donne was going thither, that gentleman was out of the sight, and far out of the reach, of his burly host. But though the latter had so far neglected the duties of hospitality as to allow his visitor to sit in the Eagle's Crag pew with no other guard of honour than the children and the governess, Mr Bradshaw determined to make up for it by extra attention during the remainder of the day. Accordingly, he never left Mr Donne. Whatever wish that gentleman expressed, it was the study of his host to gratify. Did he hint at the pleasure which a walk in such beautiful